I actually did want to watch this video. Why Twitter is insane. I mean, whether you like Jordan or dislike him, Twitter is insane. So I can't imagine he says anything in a no way. Let's get this going though.
One, before diving into this topic, I've got to clarify.
Jordan, relax.
Just resubscribed
thank you for this.
For 2 months.
Thank you.
Something. I am reading some of the pieces that I'm producing, and that means that these are things that I wrote. The reason I'm doing that rather than speaking extemporaneously is because now and then, if I'm pushing myself to the limits of my conceptual ability, then I have to choose my words with the undue care that writing allows. And I suppose that has the disadvantage that's associated with reading something rather than speaking off the cuff, but the advantage of precision and care. So today I'm going to read a piece that I entitled, "Why Twitter is Insane."
There's no way he can get this wrong. Twitter is insane. It's a terrible cesspool where people are looking for their 15 seconds of fame, constantly posting things that are more and more inflammatory and hyperbolic until they get a little bit of attention. And then the second that they get negative attention, they have a fucking meltdown and act like, what happened? How did this happen? You know how it happened. And the reality is, Jordan, that you play into it. You're one of the reasons why Twitter is insane. Twitter has manipulated you. People like Bull Blacks like to make fun of me because I don't really engage in Twitter discourse in any serious way. He's always like, oh, I wanted to make a video off of this because me and Keemstar every so often go back and forth a bit. But it's just not worth it. It's not worth it to go back and forth on Twitter. It just isn't. You're better off doing something a little more long form and thoughtful, like something like YouTube.
It is often said that social media is driving us out of our minds, individually and collectively.
I agree.
Is this true?
Yes.
And if so?
100%. I really do feel that way. You know, even without the Twitter discourse or whatever, if you look at any social, like Instagram, for instance, or just in general, people have the ability to put out the best of their lives onto social media. And what ends up happening is that you will look at that person and you compare yourself to that person and you go, wow, I'm not doing very well by comparison. Right? So you display like a dishonest aspect of your life. On top of that, you have a lot of people who will post like their, you know, bodies and other things on there. And again, you have these, it's a lot of comparative arguments. I would argue a lot of people who are frustrated in their lives are more frustrated by the comparison of somebody else than anything else. Right? Like somebody might be like middle class and they're like, oh, I'm happy. But then like if they start constantly seeing somebody who's like super rich and wealthy, all of a sudden it's like, oh, fuck. Like, why am I not doing that well? It's this interesting comparative argument. It's almost like a jealousy-driven type of a thing. And I think we all engage in it in some level. You know, like if somebody at work is doing a little bit better than you, maybe they got a promotion, maybe they got this or that. Maybe like your friend got like an A on the test and you got a B. We're constantly comparing ourselves in our everyday lives to other people in our everyday life. Social media turns that into a massive problem. It turns it into like this huge. It's just so it becomes a much larger problem.
How and why? The eminent social psychologist Jonathan Haidt recently wrote a hard-hitting article showing that use of certain forms of social media, particularly by girls just entering adolescence, was
Are we going to trans stuff, Jordan?
directly and causally associated with higher rates of depression and depression-related symptoms since the early to mid-2010s. I had been thinking along broadly similar lines, particularly with regard to Twitter.
Okay, listen. I feel like this is in like Jordan's element. I feel a little bit more, it's more of like a psychology, right? Am I saying that as a psychology, right? Psychology. What's the other word I'm thinking of? Doesn't matter. This is like in his element, but what I noticed is something weird is that I've watched a fair bit of Jordan Peterson before, and he usually speaks very genuinely, and he's not really doing that. I'm not saying that he's being dishonest or anything, but if you listen to the way that he's speaking, he almost sounds like he's on stage. Like he almost sounds like an actor. It doesn't really sound like he's talking. It sounds like he's performing a little bit. And I wonder why. I really enjoy like the calm, collected, thoughtful Jordan, and I feel like we're not really getting that, you know?
And how its incentives are structured compared to those that care.
I feel like we're getting like a production. I feel like we're getting a little bit of a production. He's a little bit out of his element. Not out of his element. He's a little bit not himself, it feels like.
Characterize healthy human interactions. The extent of its harmful pathology has recently been brought home to me as a consequence of those deliberations. Okay. A thought experiment. Okay. Imagine, for example, that you learned a particular pattern of communication in your family, one that when used on others triggered a passive or even outright aggressive resistance.
Like what? What is an example of that?
By definition.
Like when I slap my mom's ass and then I go out and try to do it with somebody else and they hit me? Like, yeah, I guess so.
The unusual method of communication you had been taught, one that did not generalize well to the broader social environment, would characterize you, at least as far as society is concerned, as insane.
I get what he's saying. I wish he'd give I wish he would give like a little bit of like an example. Like I guess for instance, that's like my wife and I call each other bitch all the time. We're just, what's up, bitch? I can't do that in public though, because of course it's disrespectful. But like that's how my wife and I talk to each other. She got me into the habit of calling her a bitch. It's weird. I used to hate the word, and then she would always call me, babe, what's up, bitch? And I'm like, all right, and then we just do that.
Now, let's ask, how does Twitter, like that family, differ from the real world in how it requires us to communicate with each other? How does it make us, too, insane? The first way is in the manner in which it bypasses the traditional means for measuring the quality of communication. In the real world, high-volume communication is extremely costly, requiring both hard-to-establish credibility, why otherwise would large numbers of people want to read or listen to you, and access to the wealth necessary for such communication, either directly through personal accumulation or by proxy, such as a contractual arrangement with a publishing house. Twitter casts these limitations asunder. The consequence of this demolition of potentially vital regulation is multiplied by the fact that Twitter provides universal access to each of its users' hard-won personal networks. The second way is how anyone, regardless of competence or social status, can comment to anyone else's entire network of followers merely by commenting on something the latter posted. That same commenter, therefore, can access all those who have chosen to follow not them, but the target of their, say, insult and derision, without having demonstrated any of the competence necessary to have attracted such attention on their own. This democratization of communication enables a parasitism completely divorced from competence. It massively inflates noise relative to signal, bypassing all the screening mechanisms that have been so painstakingly developed to shield us from incessant racket in the real world. The third way Twitter breaks the norms of standard human interaction is the...
Bro, can I be honest with you? This is a really... Okay, I know this sounds really stupid, and some people might look at me and go like, wow, you're kind of dumb. I'm going to continue watching the video, don't worry. But the video... Okay, this is something I really don't like about Smarty Pantses. A lot of time, like, Jordan is a very intelligent person. The problem is like, realistically speaking, there's a diminishing returns on the way that people speak. He's using a lot of... This is so weird, but like, it's very difficult to understand everything that he's saying here because he's using a lot of big words. And I know people are like, oh, wow, you're really dumb. You're really dumb. But it's like, well, you know, this is like a basic communication thing. I used to work for, I talk about this. I used to work for a bus company. I managed like a cleaning crew there. And I had people who I worked with who were like Hispanic. And I had a couple of guys who did, you know, they were from El Salvador. And they basically, like, they were like first, what do you say, first generation? Is that, you know, and there was a little bit of a language barrier. They weren't stupid people. But you would say some words and they'd be like, oh, what does that mean? You know? So, like, you try to speak and it's like, okay, let me try to use, like, not, you know, speak in a way where you won't understand it. And I know people be like, oh, so you just dumbed it down? It's like, no, I just, like, talked to communicate because I respect that person. And, like, Jordan is not being disrespectful by talking the way that he's talking, of course. The problem is that, like, it's one of those things where if you're trying to communicate to the general public, this is not... This is, yeah, Papa Noel. This is not really the way that you're going to get through to people by using a lot of terminology that most people aren't going to understand. And, like, I'm just admitting it. Like, I just don't care. If you're like, wow, you're dumb, I don't really care if you think I'm dumb. Because I'm pointing out something that, like, most people are probably going to be like, okay, this is, like, a little difficult to follow. You know? I'm just saying.
Zero cost and even potential benefit it imposes on those who engage in flagrant ethical misconduct. It facilitates the implied moral elevation that accrues to the accuser who adopts the position of virtuous judge merely by formulating an accusation, however vague, ill-founded, and scurrilous. In the same vein, there is no cost for insults, ad hominem attacks, and provocative statements Incitement, in other words, people can hide behind their anonymity as well and act, if possible, even more brazenly. Too often, therefore, the medium stimulates a reactive rage, as it denies even to competent users two of the main privileges traditionally granted to them: the presumption of innocence and the right and ability to engage in effective self-defense. The mob can say anything at all about you or your thoughts online, despite your hard-earned reputation, and there is nothing you can do about it. Any member of what can far too easily become a mob can level any accusation, no matter how slanderous, against anyone at all, for any reason.
You know, it's really interesting. I wonder, okay, so he's talking about how people, like he's referring to himself, obviously, about how people will, you know, they'll generate a particular, sorry, the word is escaping me. I think I'm just stupid today. People will generate credibility based on their life's work. And it seems like he's basically boiling it down to, like, you get to a point where people can just slander you and completely ruin your credibility. The thing that I don't think Jordan has explored and probably won't explore is the concept of getting kind of like attacked by a select few and allowing that to... and then your reaction to it is actually what ruins your credibility. The reality is like Jordan said some pretty crazy shit before, but his credibility wasn't assassinated because he said some crazy shit. It was because of like really the response to the criticism and the fact that like he felt less included and invited into like particular social spheres, and then he had like, you know, he had a bit of a meltdown. And it's totally understandable. I mean, we talk about that all the time, right? We talk about people not really creating, like, we'll give a specific instance. Like, for instance, I'm like, oh, I wish H3 didn't decide to just take all of his videos down with Jordan, and he actually, like, engaged in, like, some kind of a conversation with him, because he probably could have de-escalated or de-radicalized Jordan. Or at least gave him, like, a friend in the more progressive sphere. And that's probably the bigger thing more than anything else, is that, like, Jordan would say some things that, frankly, were probably not very thoughtful when he expressed them. He could have expressed himself a little bit better and more intelligently, because like he said earlier, people learn a particular way to speak to people in like their own lives, which makes perfect sense, like the different communication patterns. And then it can be difficult. Obviously, those aren't necessarily going to translate very well over Twitter. So he would misspeak, and then instead of like, oh, let me like explain or whatnot, he would just kind of get like a little irritated. People on the left would like not be particularly charitable to him. They wouldn't really create like a space for him to be like, no. They didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. It's really anything else. I feel like that's, I don't know, that's probably like a bigger factor there more than anything else, in my opinion.
Reason. And there is little or nothing that the target can do in response. Perhaps most worrisome of all is the fact that this incited rage bleeds over into the real world. All the impotent anger generated is externalized away from the social network and dispersed. Thus, the ambient emotional temperature of general society is raised, degree by degree, to the boiling point. Okay. Malignant narcissism. We know this instinctively, but it would be easy to test. An ambitious PhD student, in case one's listening, could expose one group to Twitter for half an hour, another randomly established to another social media network, and a third, if desired, to a reading task. All study participants could then be assigned, say, a competitive aggression research task to determine if Twitter exposure heightens the proclivity to respond in kind with punishment to provocation.
I feel like you'd have to do this over quite a long time, because I really feel like most people who engage in like social media don't engage in like a meaningful way in the way like Jordan does. He does to an extent exist in a more like commentary-esque sphere. And so of course you're probably going to be facing more, for lack of a better term, shit. Because you're in that sphere. I feel like most people just don't really exist in that sphere though, so it's probably not going to be that simple, but like then again, whatever, maybe I'm wrong.
I believe that Twitter's reward structure, even more than Facebook's, incentivizes malignant narcissism. It enables and benefits free riding and prioritizes psychopathic motivation. And it garners disproportionate attention in doing so, capitalizing on the attractiveness of outrageous behavior, while externalizing all the associated and inevitable costs to the innocent, broader society. This is the psychological equivalent of the tragedy of the commons, the psychological equivalent to pollution of the air we all breathe. I recently spoke about all this to the author of the article I mentioned previously, psychologist Jonathan Haidt.
It's just very interesting that, like, I feel it's just so interesting that this has like a little bit of like a victim framing. Like, dude, you're part of the problem too. The way that you engage is in a way that, like, you do the same thing. You get more and more encouraged to post like more and more inflammatory, hyperbolic things, like, you know, not particularly thoughtful responses because, like, you, for attention. Like, that's what everybody does, and you've kind of engaged in it, and now you're kind of, you know, you're sitting here like, oh, this whole thing, it's not my fault. Yeah, it kind of is. Everybody, you know, you are generally responsible for the way that you interact on social media. Obviously, generally responsible. Of course, you're responsible. And, like, you are kind of the victim of saying things in an unthoughtful manner, non-empathetic manner, in a way that isn't necessarily trying to speak to people that don't agree with you, right? And now, you know, you're getting punished for it in some capacity. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that, like, you're also part of the problem. It seems weird that you're pretending you're not.
And on the same email string to Steven Pinker, the eminent cognitive psychologist.
Steven Pinker? My best friend.
How did my psychologist colleagues react? Haidt noted that Twitter indeed cuts the link between, quote, competence or value creation and prestige/reward. Pinker likewise observed, quote,
sounds like a slur.
Contrast between Twitter and face-to-face communication is profound. I have been astounded at how some of my students and younger colleagues think nothing of spitting utterly gratuitous and unjustified snark at respected figures in their fields. I have to remind them that they may meet these figures at a conference someday.
I wonder what the context is. Like, what are the figures saying? Something stupid, you know? Like, you know, smart people say dumb shit all the time, you know?
Or that they might be on their tenure or grant review committees. The transition from meetings to Zoom in the past 2 years may have exacerbated this. But I suspect the main enabler is the sense that their reference group is their Twitter same-age peers, and that they don't have cues reminding them they're part of a multi-generational community. Pinker added, quote, there also seems to be a dynamic of weaponizing social justice so that as our society legitimately expands rights for black people, women, gay people, and transgender people.
Yes, rightfully. All right, hold on.
Same-age peers, and that they don't have cues reminding them they're part of a multi-generational community.
Here we go, Jordan Peterson on his redemption arc.
Quote, there also seems to be a dynamic of weaponizing social justice so that as our society legitimately expands rights for black people, women,
he's quoting Pinker. I wonder if he believes the trans stuff. Jordan, can you answer that? Jordan, please respond. Do you agree with the trans expansion of rights?
People and transgender people. It simultaneously creates weapons for sociocultural warfare, handing aggressive professionals a moralistic cudgel with which they can demonize their competitors. In this case, destructive trolling could also be a side effect of moral progress. Note that this would be consistent with the appeal of moralistic mobbing among younger generations. In status competitions with their seniors, they are disadvantaged along every dimension but one, claimed moral superiority. End quote.
Okay.
How much are our social media networks, these massively...
Like, I totally agree that the fuck is a cudgel? It's like a hammer kind of a thing. I agree that people weaponize social justice, but I wonder... The problem is that... Okay, Jesus Christ, I didn't want to think this much. Okay. So, in life, there are absolute factual statements that can be made. However, what you do with those factual statements is a very different question. Right? Let's bring up the paint. Let's see. Let's do like a... What factual statement should we do? Let's do the famous 52... Oh, what is it? 1352 meme, right? 13% of the population in America causes 52% of the violent murder, or something like that, right? Now, obviously, 13% is referring to black people, and this refers to a disproportionate amount of crime committed. So let's say I took this 1350 meme and I said, hey, we look at this number and we see that there's a disproportionate amount of crime within a community that is a victim of historical systemic oppression and denial of opportunity and money. Okay. That makes sense, right? So what we're doing with this factual information is we're making an intelligent claim, and well, not claim, we're observing intelligently that there is a history behind it, and it's not like an inherent quality within black people. Right? Let's say on the other hand, I decide to say, oh, look, black people are inferior, right? You say black people are more violent. They cause more crime. We got to get them out of here, right? You see how you could take a factual statement and you could twist it and push like a narrative. The reason I'm saying that in this instance is because like Jordan's talking about weaponizing social justice narratives, which is 100% true. But Jordan also doesn't really necessarily believe in too much social justice, at least when it comes to trans people and maybe even gay people, at least the LGBTQ community. So like I wonder if he's, I don't know, and maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but I kind of wonder if he's grabbing that factual statement that people are effectively virtue signaling to an extent suggest that like social justice isn't necessary. And maybe I'm just going a little too maybe I'm going a little too fucking woke brained here, but
broad-scale social experiments conducted with radically insufficient knowledge of the underlying psychological dynamics incentivizing narcissism, an idea that particularly appealed to Dr. Haidt. And how much is too much? Here's an uncomfortable conclusion.
Yeah, Jordan?
It does not take that many free riders or criminals or people who simply just don't care and who would just as soon see everything burn to radically destabilize complex social organizations. I spoke recently with the journalist Andy No about the anarchist group Antifa, for example, after being informed by some Democrats I was corresponding with that this group, Antifa, didn't really exist. I didn't know what they meant until I asked Andy how many...
Well, I think that, I don't know, I think there actually might be some organizations that like are anti-fascist organizations. At least they claim to be in some capacity. They're like, oh, we're Antifa. But I don't really, I think Antifa is more of like a loose, like a loosey goose, you know? Could I have gotten more shit in here? Wait a minute, hold on a second. No, I couldn't have. But I think it's more of like a loose structure of people that are like, I'm anti-fascist, because of course there's so many pro-fascists, you know? There probably are actually, but...
Truly active Antifa cells he thought existed in the US. And how many active full-time equivalent members each cell might have. He thought 40 cells with 20 members each. Okay. That's 800. All that damage from 800 anarchists. That's the Pareto principle. A small number of agents in any organization.
So are we talking about people, so Antifa, okay. Maybe. I mean, it might be that much violence from a small number of people. I feel like most people who identify as Antifa aren't part of like an actual structured organization. It's usually just a bunch of dumb fucking kids running around weaponizing social justice narratives like Black Lives Matter so that they can fucking cause violence because they don't really care about actually advocating for equality. They actually just care about being destructive in the name of something that makes them feel justified in their destruction because they grew up in like an upper middle class setting. And they're probably like the biggest issue with like a lot of these social justice movements is that like they weaponize them and ruin them, basically.
Or its equivalent, pull all the weight. It's worth remembering that 1% of the US population accounts for 2/3 of all violent crime.
Okay.
And that a minority of that 1% are repeat offenders. Exacerbating polarization. Have we built so-called communication systems that are capable of destabilizing our entire society? Haidt believes that it was the mere introduction of the retweet and like buttons that facilitated the tit-for-tat sharing of emotionally triggering content, particularly that capable of generating outrage.
Maybe.
If a tech innovation that small can exacerbate polarization on a societal scale, how much disruption can these communications...
You know what's interesting though? Like who's really using this technology more than anybody else though? Like who's using all this like disruptive technology the most? Is it Twitter users or is it fucking is it Twitter users or is it media organizations? You know what I mean? Like, is it your average Twitter person or is it like your CNNs? Is it your Foxes? Is it your Daily Wires? Like, who's doing it more than anybody else? I'm just saying. Like, yeah, of course, individuals are to blame as well. But, I mean, who creates these toxic environments? Just saying.
Technologies taken as a whole create enough to bring us down? The mental health data certainly indicate that a major toll has already been taken on female adolescents. What about the rest of us? What about our social institutions? It seems clear that the potential.
You know, it's interesting because he's saying that it's women that are disproportionately and negatively impacted, and I would agree. The problem that I'm having here is this like one of those situations where it's like, okay, well, what okay. So he's talking about like inflammatory social justice, or people using Twitter to like be inflammatory and weaponize social justice. I feel like when it comes to girls being the ones that are targeted or mostly negatively impacted by social media, it's not within that sphere. Like, there are tons of different spheres on the internet, right? So, I mean, and like, so when he's talking about like, we'll talk about the social justice sphere. I'm not saying there's not women in there, but like that sphere certainly exists, and that's the whole problem. But then there's like, really, okay, let's do this. Then there's like your beauty spheres. Like, honestly, if I guarantee you that the women generally, or young girls aren't really getting impacted by the social justice sphere that Jordan's talking about. Excuse me. Sorry. And they're more getting hit with, like, we talked about this earlier, like Instagrams, your social spheres, your beauty spheres. Women are generally taught by society that their biggest value, their greatest value, is how attractive they are. And so they're constantly getting bombarded with like attractive people that are using Photoshop and displaying their best version of their lives and et cetera, et cetera. And that's probably what's hitting, because I feel like that's something that impacts women more than men. Right? I don't really go on and like look at attractive men and go, oh my God, I wish I was that. Like, but women, I feel like they do. And there's a lot more attractive women in your face, the models all over social media, than there are men. And so, like, I feel like women are constantly making that comparison that we're talking about. So it's just weird because I feel like he has a grudge with, like, the social justice sphere, and that makes sense. But he's not really distinguishing these two different things here in any capacity. And it just kind of comes off as, like you're not really providing this nuance or thought here. It almost seems like he has a problem with the social justice sphere, and he's weaponizing women's like mental health to justify his frustrations with this sphere, when they would really rest within like the beauty sphere more than anything else. That's what it feels like more than anything else. It's almost ironic. I don't think he's doing it intentionally, but like you're kind of doing what all these other kids do, where they like weaponize social narratives in some capacity to display one of your points, even though your point, like specifically about women, they're not really getting negatively impacted in like the social justice sphere. So
Psychological and sociological harm engendered by the increasingly monopolistic communication enterprises engaging our society are such that we should at least consider a push to conduct research on the matter, with an eye to conceptualizing, designing, and improving social media sharing platforms that aren't prima facie insane and contagiously so.
Okay.
We must do so before our new, and in some ways miraculous, mass communication systems pollute the social world beyond repair.
Jordan Peterson, uncensored, now on the Daily Wire. Wow, Jordan, you are a sussy baka. All right, well, interesting. Yeah, that's funny. Women are the most impacted by harmful social media. And then, you know, of course, Jordan is what is he doing? He's giving his comment on overweight women in social media and perpetuating like the whole... he's like literally a contributor, really, if you think about it, because he's the one that's like continuously reinforcing that like women have to look a certain way to be on social media. Like that's the toxicity aspect of social media. So Jordan is really Jordan kind of is virtue signaling here a little bit. Jordan is an inflammatory asshole to women sometimes, and then he's like, yeah, but it's not my fault, it's the social media's fault. That's really a separate issue. I mean, it's in the same like social media sphere, but like you seem to be like using women's issues, internet issues, to kind of like propel your own like flawed logic. So unfortunate stuff. Very unfortunate. That's more like Kermit the Frog. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and another special shout out to all my Patreon and Twitch subs. If you'd like to support this channel further than you already have by just watching the video alone, go down to the links below where you can sub on my Patreon, which will allow you to get your name on this beautiful black wall. Or you can go to the Twitch page and you can actually use a free Amazon Prime sub, if you have Amazon Prime, to subscribe. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.